3,127. That is the exact number of low-frequency, imperceptible seismic events recorded shifting the ocean floor off the coast of southern Oregon within a single 7-day window. None of these tremors possessed the energy to register on human senses, yet almost every single one of them aligned along a singular high-risk fault system, carrying the structural capacity to inundate the entire Pacific Northwest. Then, at exactly 4:35 a.m., a localized displacement occurred, registering a magnitude 5.5, a shockwave powerful enough to propagate north across the international border into Canada. In isolation, a magnitude 5.5 is a minor routine parameter in global seismology, typically relegated to a single line in an agency log. However, this event did not occur in isolation. It materialized directly along a critical segment of a fault line that had been systematically loading under tectonic strain for days. Situated within a 326-year seismic silence that must inevitably terminate, the primary paradox of this event lies in the profound mismatch between its modest physical scale and its critical geographic position. At 4:35 a.m., while the coastal population of Oregon slept, a sudden slip occurred 218 kilometers west of the municipality of Bandon, at a focal depth of roughly 10 kilometers beneath the ocean surface. Despite its moderate energy release, the resulting low-frequency waves traveled over 300 kilometers, gently rocking structures in Victoria, British Columbia. The United States Geological Survey initially logged the event at magnitude 5.4 before refining the calculation upward to 5.5. Globally, this is a middling release of energy. Contextually, however, it occurred at the most hazardous structural intersection in North America. This earthquake struck the southern boundary of a major subduction zone immediately following a week of dense, unmonitored slow-slip activity. The primary analytical focus is not the magnitude of the displacement, but its precise coordinates: 43.38 degrees north latitude and 127.08 degrees west longitude. Because the epicenter was located far offshore, the immediate physical hazard was minimal, prompting a green alert status from automated monitoring networks, signifying no immediate casualties or infrastructure damage. Yet, the systemic sensitivity of the region was immediately evident. Within 4 minutes of the primary shock, an automated tsunami warning entry flickered briefly in the raw data feed near 43.5 degrees north, before being manually stood down by analysts who confirmed the sideways slip nature of the faulting. This minor system response underscores a profound institutional vigilance. Along this coast, even minor activity is treated as a precursor to catastrophic failure until proven otherwise. To evaluate the true significance of this localized failure, we must analyze the structural deficit and the depletion of stress barriers that occurred in the days preceding the event. The magnitude 5.5 rupture was preceded by an intense silent surge of episodic tremor and slip along the southern margin of the Cascadia subduction zone. Over the course of the week, highly sensitive GPS and seismic instruments logged approximately 3,127 distinct slow-slip epicenters, including a concentrated burst of over 500 individual events in a single evening. This massive, slow-motion displacement occurred at depths of 30 to 40 kilometers, where high temperatures and pressurized fluids prevent the fault from locking completely, allowing it to creep silently over days or weeks. While this deep creep relieves localized stress, it does not dissipate the system's total energy. Instead, it transfers the accumulated tectonic load directly upward onto the cold, brittle, locked portion of the fault above. This locked mega-thrust interface has been continuously storing strain since its last major rupture in the year 1700. By transferring stress to this locked zone, the silent slow-slip surge acted as a mechanical loader, nudging a highly strained system closer to its ultimate structural limit. This leads us to the fundamental mechanical connection at the heart of this geophysical system. The southern Oregon coast sits at a complex tectonic junction where several distinct plates and boundaries interact at varying speeds and trajectories. To the west lies the Blanco fracture zone and the Gorda plate boundary, a region dominated by horizontal, sideways sliding transform faults. This morning's magnitude 5.5 earthquake occurred along this horizontal transform system, which explains the lack of vertical seafloor displacement and the absence of a tsunami. However, this slip occurred directly adjacent to the locked megathrust boundary of the Cascadia subduction zone, where the Juan de Fuca and Gorda plates are being forced downward between the North American plate at a rate of 30 to 45 millimeters per year. The critical question confronting geophysicists is not whether a sideways sliding magnitude 5.5 earthquake can cause destruction, but how the transfer of stress from a week of deep, slow slip, combined with this sudden transform fault displacement, alters the delicate stability of the adjacent and heavily loaded megathrust boundary. Are we observing routine background adjustments of a complex tectonic junction, or has this local displacement shifted the balance of forces on a giant locked fault that has been silently storing 40 feet of potential plate motion for over 3 centuries? To grasp why a magnitude 5.5 earthquake on this specific margin causes seismologists to pause, we must first dismantle our superficial understanding of seismic measurements. Public perception is trained to treat earthquake magnitude as a simple linear index. In reality, the scale is logarithmic. Every whole unit increase represents a 32-fold increase in released energy. A magnitude 6.5 release is 32 times greater than this morning's event. A 7.5 is 1,000 times greater. And the magnitude 9.0 rupture, this fault is ultimately engineered to produce releases hundreds of thousands of times more energy. If today's event is a single match struck in the dark, a full-margin Cascadia rupture is a massive urban firestorm. The two events share a scale, but are separated by a physical chasm so vast that grouping them together obscures the true scale of the threat. The energy budget of a magnitude 5.5 is completely insufficient to relieve the accumulated strain on the adjacent system. It does not act as a safety valve. It is merely a localized fracture on the periphery of an immense, locked reservoir. This brings us to the geometric distinction between the two distinct fault architectures interacting off the coast. The event this morning occurred on a transform boundary where tectonic plates slide horizontally past one another, like two hands pressed flat and rubbed side to side. Because this motion lacks a vertical component, it does not displace the ocean column above it, which is the physical reason no tsunami was generated. In stark contrast, the adjacent subduction megathrust descends at a shallow angle. When it fails, the overriding continental plate lurches upward, instantly displacing cubic kilometers of seawater. The harmless horizontal motion of the transform fault occurred directly at the threshold of this upward thrusting megathrust. This structural proximity explains the heightened human and institutional vigilance across the Pacific Northwest. When the ocean floor shifted, the rigid, cold crust of the region acted as a highly efficient waveguide, transmitting long-period seismic waves hundreds of kilometers with minimal attenuation. This is why residents in Victoria, British Columbia, felt a slow, rolling motion in the dark. For a population living atop a documented subduction hazard, this physical sensation immediately triggers a rational question. Was this the primary initiation? This reflex is not paranoia. It is the logical result of systemic education, defined by tsunami evacuation routes and seismic building codes. Yet, this heightened sensitivity often breeds superficial interpretations, such as claims of institutional cover-ups or suppressed earthquake predictions. Deconstructing these narratives requires examining how hazard data is managed. The threat of the Cascadia subduction zone is not a hidden secret. It is one of the most thoroughly mapped, publicly documented hazards in existence. The true impediment to preparedness is not secrecy, but the human tendency to ignore slow, high-consequence threats in favor of immediate concerns. Furthermore, deterministic earthquake prediction, specifying the exact day, time, and magnitude of an impending rupture, remains physically impossible. While tectonic strain accumulates at a steady measurable rate of 30 to 45 millimeters per year, the ultimate failure of the fault is a highly chaotic process. Rupture initiation depends on micromechanical variables, microscopic structural variations, localized fluid pressures, and frictional coefficients deep within the crust that cannot be observed or modeled. We can measure the steady loading of the system, but we cannot predict which specific stress increment will cause the final catastrophic failure. Today's earthquake was very likely a routine readjustment of the transform boundary, but because it occurred on a heavily loaded margin, It serves as a physical reminder that the silent accumulation of strain continues uninterrupted toward its absolute physical limit. To fully comprehend the loading mechanism of this system, we must descend 30 to 40 kilometers below the surface of the Earth, into the zone of episodic tremor and slip. In this deep regime, elevated temperatures and high fluid pressures alter the mechanical behavior of the fault plane. Instead of remaining locked and brittle, the rock creeps forward slowly over days or weeks. This deep, silent creep was completely invisible to science until the early 2000s, when two technological advancements converged. First, networks of continuous GPS receivers planted along the Pacific Northwest coast began detecting a highly unusual phenomenon. Every 14 months or so, the landward movement of the coast briefly reversed, sliding seaward for a couple of weeks before resuming its slow landward creep. Second, seismologists identified a corresponding low-frequency acoustic signature in their data, a continuous, subtle rumble that lacked the sharp arrival times of an ordinary earthquake. Together, these measurements revealed that the deep fault was slipping silently, loading the locked, shallow megathrust above it. Each slow slip event acts as a subtle increment of stress, transferred directly onto the brittle portion of the plate interface that has been stuck for over 3 centuries. This is why the dense cluster of over 3,000 tremor epicenters immediately preceding this morning's earthquake is a critical mechanical signal. It represents an active physical acceleration of the loading cycle on the southern segment of the fault zone. The magnitude of the threat stored by this silent loading is defined by the physical evidence of the last full margin rupture. On the evening of January 26, 1700, the Cascadia subduction zone failed along its entire 1,000-kilometer length. Reconstructing this historical event required a precise convergence of independent paleoseismic disciplines. Along the coastal estuaries of Washington and Oregon, researchers identified ghost forests of western red cedar that had died standing. These trees did not decay from external factors. Their roots were suddenly submerged in salt water as the coastline underwent rapid coseismic subsidence, dropping by a meter or two in a single evening. The mud layers directly overlying these drowned root systems contained sheets of marine sand, indicating a massive tsunami had immediately swept inland. While the drowned trees proved a massive earthquake had occurred, they could not provide a precise calendar date. That final chronological link was discovered on the opposite side of the Pacific Ocean. Historic Japanese documents from January 1700 recorded an orphan tsunami, a series of large destructive waves that struck their coastlines on the early hours of January 27th and 28th, with no local felt earthquake to explain them. By calculating the travel time of a gravity wave crossing the deep ocean basins of the Pacific, scientists traced the origin of this orphan wave back to the Pacific Northwest, establishing the exact timing of the rupture to approximately 9 in the evening on January 26, 1700, and estimating its magnitude at somewhere close to 9. This historical benchmark is corroborated by deep-sea sediment cores retrieved from the underwater canyons cutting the continental slope. These cores contain distinct layers of coarse graded sediment known as turbidites, which are deposited when severe shaking triggers massive undersea landslides. By dating these turbidite sequences, marine geologists have documented 19 or 20 of these great shaking events over the past 10,000 years. The average recurrence interval is roughly 500 years, but the intervals themselves are highly irregular, with some spanning less than 200 years. The southern segment of the subduction zone, adjacent to this morning's magnitude 5.5 earthquake, is shown to rupture even more frequently on its own. With 326 years having elapsed since the last major release of energy, the plates have continued their inexorable convergence, accumulating 10 to 13 meters, the better part of 40 feet, of potential displacement along the locked plate boundary. The system is well within its historical window of recurrence, holding an immense volume of elastic strain that must inevitably be discharged. With the structural history established and the deep mechanical loading decoded, we must confront the immediate diagnostic question. What physical scenario does this magnitude 5.5 earthquake represent? The system can be analyzed through three distinct, competing frameworks. The first and mathematically most probable scenario is that of routine background activity. Under this framework, today's rupture was a localized, self-contained failure on the Blanco Transform Fault. The stress released was entirely confined to this horizontal boundary, and its temporal alignment with the deep slow-slip surge is interpreted as a statistical coincidence, an ordinary event occurring on a highly active, independent system that shares a spatial boundary but operates under a separate stress budget. The second framework describes a direct stress response. In this model, the two systems are mechanically coupled. The week of dense slow-slip activity at 30 kilometers depth did not simply dissipate. It physically transferred a calculated increment of shear stress upward and outward into the surrounding crust. This stress migration loaded the adjacent transform faults, bringing a locked patch of the Blanco boundary to its shear strength limit ahead of its independent timeline. In this interpretation, the silent surge was the direct physical trigger, and the felt magnitude 5.5 was the direct consequence. This demonstrates a high level of system interdependency, showing how silent, slow-motion displacements can rapidly drive nearby brittle faults to failure. The third and most critical framework is that of a foreshock. Under this scenario, the magnitude 5.5 rupture represents the initial, localized microfracturing of a much larger aspherical contact on the main subduction interface. The first mechanical failure before the propagation of a full margin magnitude 9.0 rupture. While historical database statistics indicate that only 5 to 10% of moderate earthquakes are followed by a larger event, the consequences of this low probability scenario are so massive that it dictates the entire regional monitoring strategy. In geophysics, a true foreshock can only be identified in hindsight, as its real-time seismic waves are physically indistinguishable from routine background events. This brings us to the core dilemma of seismic risk communication and the human factor. The regional infrastructure of the Pacific Northwest sits atop soft, sedimentary basins that are mathematically tuned to amplify low-frequency seismic energy, creating a high-risk environment for unreinforced masonry and modern coastal developments. Our current monitoring networks can observe the silent loading of the deep fault with millimeter precision, yet we remain entirely unable to calculate the exact moment when the brittle crust will reach its ultimate shear limit. The physical system does not provide a deterministic countdown. It only provides a steady, measurable accumulation of strain. The magnitude 5.5 earthquake did not relieve this strain. It merely highlighted the active, highly loaded state of the southern segment. Whether this event was a routine background fracture, a direct response to deep stress transfer, or a rare precursor to a larger rupture, the underlying physical reality remains unchanged. The structural limit of the Cascadia subduction zone is being systematically approached, and the 326-year silence of the giant offshore continues to diminish. To fully evaluate the events of this morning, we must zoom out from the Pacific Northwest to address a common cognitive bias in natural hazard analysis: the temptation to connect distant, unrelated geological anomalies. In the very week of the Oregon earthquake, global seismic monitoring networks logged a dense swarm of tremors off the Philippines and a significant lithospheric jolt off the coast of Alaska. To a superficial observer, these global events suggest a planet-wide tectonic activation, a synchronized surge of planetary stress. However, rigorous systems analysis rejects this narrative. The physical distance between these margins means they are mechanically decoupled. The stress budget of the Blanco fracture zone is entirely independent of the subduction dynamics in the Western Pacific or the Aleutian Arc. Tectonic plates behave as rigid bodies over continental scales, but their localized boundary interactions are governed by local stress fields, not a global subterranean pulse. Distinguishing real localized signals from distant background noise is the first prerequisite of rigorous geophysical forecasting. This division between signal and noise is mirrored in how our monitoring infrastructure processed the morning's event. The brief, automated tsunami warning that flickered in the digital feed 4 minutes after the rupture was a direct result of predictive algorithms executing their default parameters. These systems are calibrated with a deliberate bias toward false positives because the structural cost of a missed detection is catastrophic. It fell to human analysts, interpreting the real-time arrivals of compressional and shear waves to determine the physical mechanism of the slip. Once they confirmed that the motion was horizontal, transform faulting rather than vertical displacement along the subduction interface, the alert was systematically terminated. This operational sequence exposes a profound truth about our relationship with geological systems. We have built highly sensitive warning networks that can capture the minute clearing of a fault's throat. Yet we remain entirely dependent on human interpretation to translate raw physical movement into actionable safety. This structural tension defines the limits of our civilizational preparedness. We have constructed modern urban centers on a margin that operates on a geological timeline, meaning our societies are built upon a structural deficit. The magnitude 5.5 earthquake did not reset the Cascadia clock, nor did it drain the physical reservoir of strain that has been filling since the winter of 1700. The better part of 40 feet of accumulated plate convergence remains locked within the crust, held back by a frictional boundary that is systematically being loaded by deep, silent, slow-slip events. Today's event was a minor mechanical adjustment on the periphery of this loaded system, a transient whisper from a boundary that is fully capable of a catastrophic scream. Ultimately, the most precise and honest scientific synthesis we can offer is this: today's earthquake very probably has no long-term predictive value for the region, and the stress state of the main subduction zone remains practically unchanged. Yet, the absolute limit of our science is that we cannot prove this comfort with certainty. We are forced to exist in a state of probabilistic anticipation, knowing that the physical laws of stress accumulation are absolute, that the system is loaded, and that the long-term recurrence interval is a physical boundary that cannot be bypassed. The floor of the Pacific Ocean spoke this morning, not to announce a countdown, but to demonstrate that the massive tectonic engine beneath the coast is fully active, operating on its own timeline, and waiting for the frictional limits of the rock to finally give way.